I swear, this isn't going to be a horror channel. I don't like horror. But reading World War Z over and over again got me thinking about the only other zombie media I've been able to consume. So let's talk about The Girl with All the Gifts. I don't want to say The Girl with All the Gifts had a bad ending. It was actually a great ending, subversive, well-written, and engaging, but it had one major sin, and that's that it made me sad. And I am the kind of person who will stop reading a book just because it makes me sad. I could, and maybe someday will, make a list of all the books that I've stopped reading just because they made me sad. But for now, let's start at the beginning.
The end.
The Girl with All the Gifts follows Melanie, a little girl who, when we are introduced to her, all we can tell is that she's in a prison. The book explains how she and plenty of other kids live in cells, have to be strapped into wheelchairs, aren't allowed to interact with each other, and are only allowed out of their cells for school. We're let in pretty early on that these are not normal kids. I mean, they eat maggots. But we're not given an explanation for over 100 pages. And by then, the compound where the kids have been kept has been taken over, and Melanie, her teacher, I'm going to call her Miss J, here's how to pronounce her actual name,
Justino,
as well as Sergeant Parks, Dr. Caldwell, and Private Gallagher, who are the only people who managed to escape from the base when it was invaded, not by zombies, but by survivalists, the whack jobs who stockpile weapons and make booby traps, and who the book calls junkers.
Survival.
So then the rest of the book follows the 5 of them as they try to walk through England from the base to the new city of Beacon, 60 miles to the south. And to my American self, 60 miles does not seem that far. I need to drive 90 miles to see family, and I do that a few times a month. My job is almost 30 miles from where I live. But 60 miles, depending on if it's in a city or open land, can take between 18 and 30 hours to walk. And by this point, Dr. Caldwell has blood poisoning, so they wouldn't be going fast, even if they didn't have to avoid zombies.
I'm sick.
The main conflict of the story is between Miss J, Sergeant Parks, and Dr. Caldwell. The base was Dr. Caldwell's baby. It's been 20 years since society collapsed, and now Dr. Caldwell is the last scientist standing who is looking for a cure. And she believes the cure is somewhere in Melanie and children like her, because unlike World War Z, the Girl with All the Gifts did try to reinvent the zombie wheel. Melanie, even though she is infected, she's not a mindless zombie whose only goal is to eat flesh, like most zombies in this world. She can think and grow and is a whole person. And the book actually goes into a lot of detail explaining how the zombie infection works. Basically, everyone who's infected has a fungus, who I also can't pronounce,
Ophiocordyceps,
which is an actual fungus that exists, but it mainly affects ants. But Melanie and the other children are affected by it differently because the big reveal is that the fungus does not have turning someone's brain to mush to a perfect science. So some zombies maintain enough function to have babies, and those babies have partial immunity to the virus, like Melanie. I've never played or seen The Last of Us, but from what I can tell, this book is a nice mix between that and The Promised Neverland. Anyway, back to the conflict. So Dr. Caldwell is looking for a cure for Melanie, and rather than seeing her as a person, she sees her as test subject number 1, and she wants to cut her up and see how she ticks. Meanwhile, Sergeant Parks just sees Melanie as a zombie, and he treats her like a loaded weapon, which is fair. Even though Melanie is not mindless, she still needs to eat meat, and she can go into a feeding frenzy. That's another one of the early signs we got that there's something weird with the kids. Early on, when the kids are still at base, Sergeant Parks tries to remind Miss J what the kids are by wiping off the chemical that hides their human scent and setting off one of the kids. Then later, Miss J goes to see Melanie and forgets to cover her human scent, and Melanie goes into somewhat of a feeding frenzy.
I'm hungry.
Still, Miss J is Melanie's teacher, and she sees her as a little girl. So the conflict is her fighting Sergeant Parks and Dr. Caldwell on how to treat Melanie and what she's capable of. For a lot of their walk, Melanie is handcuffed and muzzled, because that's the compromise for even letting her stay with them. And then Private Gallagher is just there. He works for Sergeant Parks and answers to him, but he doesn't feel much conflict in regards to Melanie. Private Gallagher, unlike all the other adults, was actually born after society collapsed. So the world as he knows it is all he's ever known. And all his conflict revolves around going back to Beacon and the terror of going back to the old life that he tried to escape by joining the army. And that terror is what ends up killing him.
I want to just lie down and die!
The five of them walk for about 2 days, with some close encounters with zombies, before they come across Rosalind Franklin, which is the name of the fortified vehicle that was sent off originally to find the cure. But now it's been abandoned, and all the scientists who were meant to find the cure were dead. And I haven't read The Boy on the Bridge yet, but from what I can tell, it's a prequel explaining what happened to Rosalind Franklin, or Rosie for short, and her crew. And I'm excited to read it. Anyway, they find Rosie in the middle of London and try to get her moving again, since again, it's London. It was packed with people before the outbreak, and now it's packed with zombies. They really don't want to have to walk all the way through London to Beacon.
London Bridge is falling down. Help me out. Look.
And while they're working on getting Rosie up and running, Melanie goes off and discovers other partially immune children like her. We're told early on that Melanie, along with the other children in her class who didn't escape the base, were found by the army. So she comes across the feral children who the army didn't find. So that's another point of conflict. Melanie's been processing, learning what she is and what she's capable of this entire time. So finding more people like her adds a whole new element to everything she's feeling. Plus now we have a bunch of smart, flesh-eating feral children and a bunch of adults who don't know about them. And they don't know because by this point, Dr. Caldwell has tried to cut Melanie up at the base and chased her through a house trying to examine her. So she doesn't trust Dr. Caldwell, and she knows if she told the doctor about the children, she'd go and start cutting them up.
Wild human! Wild human!
And that actually happens. When everyone else is away from Rosie, some of the children come and investigate it, and Dr. Caldwell lures one of them halfway inside and dissects him. But it's Melanie being right and not telling Dr. Caldwell about the children initially that kills Private Gallagher, because she comes back and lies that there are Junkers instead. So Gallagher takes off, intending to leave the group, forget about Beacon, and start a new life on his own. And the children find him and eat him. Then, not long after, Dr. Caldwell, who, as I said, has blood poisoning, also dies. And her death is satisfying because we get a lot of answers in that chapter, but the actual death itself is not the revenge you would want from a crusty old... What kind of town do I want this to be? I don't like Dr. Caldwell. She's a bad person. But she dies fairly painlessly and only gets punched in the face once through the whole book.
Punch him in the face.
And then Sergeant Park dies too. The zombie children actually go after him and Miss J after they try to get their friend back from Dr. Caldwell. And this is where Melanie kills their leader and Sergeant Parks gets bit. So they drag Miss J back to Rosie, then they go to this behemoth of the fungus that they've stumbled across, and they set the whole thing on fire, so it will release its seed pods, and they can go into the air to infect everyone. And at first, Sergeant Parks is horrified, but Melanie explains that humans are over with. Between societal collapse and the Junkers, and everything that led to Private Gallagher running away to try and avoid returning to Beacon, they can't get their act together enough to ever come back. And if they try, they're just going to end up killing all the zombie children, who Melanie decided will inherit the Earth. And then Sergeant Parks finishes turning and Melanie kills him.
Bring out your dead!
And then Miss J comes to, and she realizes that her role with Melanie is reversed. Where before Melanie was a prisoner and Miss J the benevolent caregiver, now Miss J is a prisoner who is in charge of educating all the feral children, and Melanie is her caregiver. And that's a beautiful, narratively positive ending. But having Private Gallagher and Sergeant Parks, who was turned to be less of a bastard, die made me sad.
I do love a happy ending, don't you?
But otherwise, I did really like The Girl with All the Gifts. It's a lovely book. One warning I will give is that it is a gory story. It goes into excruciating detail about how Dr. Caldwell cut off children, how her blood poisoning progressed, and every injury everyone gets. There's this one part where Melanie's off hunting to try and starve off her feeding frenzy, and she comes across a stray cat. And the book goes into excruciating detail on how she gets the cat and eats it. She hollows it out. Meanwhile, I was sitting in bed and I just looked up from my book at my own cat who was sleeping next to me, and I had to stop and just watch her breathe for a minute because that was an intense scene. And if that kind of gore is too much for you, this is not the book for you. She heard me talking about her. So the big takeaways that I took from it as a writer is, first of all, hi baby. Yeah, you wanna say hi to the camera? Jeez. Cat. Yeah. Right. The big takeaways I got from this as a writer was, first of all, the suspense. We know something is off right away, but it isn't until 50 pages in that we even start to get introduced to zombies as hungries. We get over 100 pages in before we start to realize that Melanie and the other children are zombies. Over 150 pages in before she starts to understand that she's a zombie. It's this slow, creeping suspense trying to figure out what's happening and why and what's up with these children. And we get just dropped information slowly that makes it so satisfying. And you can learn a lot about writing suspense from even just the first 150 pages.
Tension is killing me.
Another thing I got from this is how to write from different perspectives. It's written in third person limited, so even though we're not in the characters' heads like they were writing the story, we're still only aware of one person's thoughts at a time. And that keeps it very refreshing and allows the reader to learn a lot more than if we just followed one character. It also allows us to sympathize more with the characters, which is good because they are all deeply, deeply flawed.
Man's greatest flaw.
I also liked how short the chapters generally are. There was one chapter that was half a page, and it feels like the story moves faster when you break it up like that, which is good, because a lot of the story happens from Melanie's point of view, trapped in a cell or just as they walked at an agonizingly slow pace towards Beacon. Plus, I was able to tell when action was happening because those chapters tended to be longer. Chapter length can affect pacing and readability so much. It adds suspension, allowing for smoother transitions from one character point of view to another, and it just makes it easier to say one more chapter before bed when the chapter is only 3 pages long. I stayed up past my bedtime every night this week because of that. So now I'm going to take a nap. Thanks for watching. Now go read The Girl with All the Gifts.